Uh, Murch, as I left the bridge, said, "I'll come back as soon as I can."
And then I remember the water was filled with yelling, screaming men, some of whom I knew, and some of whom I tried to encourage. And then I saw a beagle slipping through the water, and I think with a light on it, picking out looking at men in the water. And then I saw the ship's boat from Beagle. It was a very angry sea. You actually had to ride it in order to keep your head above the crest of the breaking waves. And I pointed that cheap flashlight, this sounds like a flashlight advertisement, at the ship's boat of Beagle. And I blinked out what I think was not SOS, but OSO or something like that. Mm. But anyway, the ship's boat came over toward me, and I managed to get alongside, but couldn't get in. And a strong arm leaned over and held me alongside of the ship's boat. And then that boat pulled over toward Beagle, dragging me.
The situation when we found you and many, many others in the water was that we filled the whaler up. After all, a whaler is only 27 foot long. It's pulled by 5 men. It has 5 oars. It wasn't a gasoline gig like you have in your Navy. It was actually pulled with oars. And we found that eventually we had a situation where there were so many insensible people, some of them quite badly wounded and some of them unconscious in the boat, that we were actually, or we, I say, my boat's crew was actually sitting on their bodies to pull the oars. And we didn't have much freeboard left because of this, only about 3 or 4 inches. We had buoyancy casks in the whaler, but nobody should rely on that. If we'd been swamped, we could have quite easily sunk. So when you mentioned an arm, I think it was probably one of my arms, because we had loops of rope around the outside of the whaler, which other American sailors and soldiers were hanging on to. But I think I was the only person with arms over the side, because my other arm was also occupied by somebody else. And I was steering the boat with a tiller between my knees, in fact. Well, then Beagle came back. We went alongside to get you all out of the boat and up on the iron deck.
And then that boat pulled over toward Beagle, dragging me, where there was a steel ladder up to the deck of the destroyer. And a petty officer leaned over and said to me, "Climb for it, man, climb for it." And the next thing I knew, I was lying on the deck, and somebody was about to stick a morphine syringe into my arm, and I must have been yelling, but I waved it away and said, "I don't need that." And that's how my life was saved on that night. I suppose I got on Beagle just soon enough, because I think while I was lying on the deck, Beagle suddenly got underway again and began to fire star shells. I understood later that they picked up a contact which they thought was the E-boats returning. And that I was lucky to be on deck, because it turned out that a number of our men were hanging on ropes and ladders alongside, and a number of them were swept into the screw.
The E-boats did come back. Murch was conducting an act of obvious mercy, but in many senses it was contrary to his obligation to conduct this battle, which clearly he had to do. And so as soon as they reappeared, he gave the order to cast us off, and must have said full ahead, and off you went. And there were people hanging on to the side. We had a jumping net, if you remember what a jumping net's hanging down well, for people to climb up. And some of the people on that jumping net were swept aside, swept away, and some of them did go, in fact, into the maelstrom of the starboard shaft, which was a very horrid situation. And I can only say, I haven't talked about this for 45 years, I suppose, or whatever, but I had nightmares about that moment for years afterwards, for quite a long time. We went back and we got another boatload, and then we caught sight of a small landing craft which came either from your ship or the other one.
It was from my ship.
It was from your ship. And it was commanded by a bosun, I think.
May have been by the captain of the ship, that is, by name C.B. Stanley, known to us as Stan. That is, I've seen a photograph, and I remember seeing him at least at the tiller, or at the little wheel of that motorboat.
Well, if you look at that photograph, I'm sitting alongside him. If it's a photograph of the landing craft alongside Beagle, then that is me sitting alongside him. Because what happened was, we met him. I never discovered who it was. I thought he was a petty officer, but that was
slightly balding, dark.
Slightly balding, about 35 years old, I would have said. Delightful man. He met us, and he said to me, look, it's better for you to put those survivors you've got in my landing craft. So we did. And that particular photograph that we both got was taken from the deck of Beagle at dawn. There was enough light then to take photographs. Somebody took a photograph. And it's rather, again, rather sad photograph. There are bodies laid out in the bottom of this landing craft. And it was at that point that we stopped using the whaler. The whaler was hoisted, and I said to the captain I would stay in this American landing craft, and we would go on continuing to pick up as many people as possible. And in fact, we did just that. I've forgotten what happened to this man, if he was your captain, but we certainly picked up a lot. And then we got to the point, it must have been about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, still at dawn. After all, it was a June morning, which is shortest day time, when all the people we found were drowned. And the captain at this point was very aware that he'd been drifting during the course of this operation into a shallow minefield. And the navigator, of course, had been pointing this out to him, and Norman Murch was the sort of man that, while he was perfectly aware of the risk he was taking, was equally determined to save everybody he possibly could. And at this point he simply said, look, we counted the dead. I think we counted 270 approximately, people who were clearly drowned. What they'd done is that they'd put on their life belts incorrectly, so that instead of the K-Fock flotation part being on their chest, which would have kept their chest and head out of the water, they'd put it on so that their head fell forward, and we found them with their back uppermost, which is a very tragic situation. Well, what happened then was that everybody was got back on board, and we went back to Portsmouth with the survivors. Sadly, some of the survivors died. Some of them we buried at sea. And having nothing more useful to do, I sat with some of these sailors who were clearly dying. They were all, things struck me, they were all very conscious. And they talked about their girlfriends, and they were called the girls they loved. And I listened to the first man, and about 20 minutes later he died. And then I went to sit with another man, and exactly the same thing happened. And then I went to sit with a third man, and exactly the same thing happened. And I must say this made a very profound impression on me, because it made me realize that at the moment of death, if you're conscious, and if you're also a vigorous young man, the thing that comes into your mind is you think of those you've loved and who love you. And I found that very, very moving. There's one thing I'd like to say about Norman Murch, our captain. When this action was over, on the 9th of June, he subsequently was reprimanded by the Admiralty for hazarding his ship by taking it into a shallow minefield. Several months later, in Australia, I had the great pleasure and delight to be present on the quarterdeck of the flagship of the British Pacific Fleet, the Duke of York, when Admiral Lord Fraser of the North Cape invested Norman Murch with the American Order of Merit, which had been awarded to him by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in recognition of his services to America.
I would like to have been there to see Norman Murch receive that citation from President Roosevelt as well. I remember that when I first met him, and on subsequent occasions as well, when we discussed what Beagle did under his command that night, going into the German minefield to rescue the American survivors. He ended the conversations by saying, yes, if I had to do it over again, I would do the same thing. Whereupon I said, yes, sir, it was the right thing to do. I owe my life to him and to you.
Has gone back to England now, and the 9th of June has come, 45 years after that terrible night. I was lucky that night. A lot of my shipmates weren't. Most of the Army men on board that ship were killed. They were down in the troop compartments when the torpedo hit us. Imagine what it was like to be caught in a strange place with the lights out and only a few holes and ladders to escape through. The ship soon was burning and exploding from stem to stern. But a lot of my crew were killed too that night, even though they were familiar with the ship. And I used to try to remember them in the years after the war, because nobody else would remember them, I thought, except perhaps their families.
But I still remember them, and I want to remember them. I don't want to forget. Some of them I was very good friends with. There were, for example, 4 black steward's mates. In those days, the only thing a black sailor could do was wait on officers. I remember them well. Shirley, Slaughter, Thomas, and Scott. Scott was a semi-literate boy from Los Angeles. I think he was 16 or 17 years old, and he had a hearing defect, which also gave him a speech defect. But he wanted to go to Harvard, to the law school, and he wrote away for books to study. I used to help him. He tried to memorize the dictionary, starting with the letter A, and he used to come in my room, and I would hear him a page at a time while he recited the meanings of the words. I saw him that night in the water. He was fighting the waves and terrified. And I think I made a joke, a bad joke in the water. That didn't help much. And then later he was picked up dead, and he was one of the men Beagle buried at sea on the way back to Portsmouth. Then there were men in the communications division. I was the communications officer. And in the quartermaster's corps, which stood watch with the watch officers. I knew them very well indeed. Mahan, a second-class seaman, a seaman from Massachusetts. Fitch, Edmonds, a boy from North Carolina, grew up on a farm. Winter, a bespectacled, somewhat bookish man. And Chandler, another young, thin Southerner who was a radio man. Then I remember Carr, a bosun's mate, who was very good friends with another seaman named Murphy. Carr was killed that night. I think he was one of the men who slipped into the screw when Beagle went underway again, thinking that the E-boats had come back to attack, which they may have done. Afterwards, Murphy was inconsolable about the loss of that dear friend. And there was a machinist's mate named Scoggins who was caught in the engine room after the torpedo hit, crushed by machinery. He was seen from the hole, from the outside of the ship. I remember him because as communications officer, I used to censor the sailors' mail. He sent a special delivery letter every day to his wife who had a baby after we'd gone abroad, gone overseas. Then there was Ted Myers, another machinist mate, who was the ship's barber. He often cut my hair and did it with a certain professional style that everybody enjoyed. I wrote a letter to his mother and father afterwards, trying to explain how he died. And then there was some other men I really didn't know very well. There was a man named Smith, who was a small boat officer, and Lane, another machinist mate. I once put him on report for sleeping on watch when I went into the engine room and he was dozing. And there were others as well. They were all young. They wanted to live as much as I did. We were all young then. It was a long time ago, hard to remember, and yet I want to remember them. I need to remember them. It reminds me of a Siegfried Sassoon poem about